20,000 gallons of water a minute, flowing out of the Arizona desert at a constant 70 degrees, every hour of every day, for thousands of years, and for nearly a century, almost none of it was allowed to reach the canyon it was born to fill. That is not an exaggeration. That is what happened to Fossil Creek, a stream tucked into the rugged country between Camp Verde and Payson, Arizona, where a concrete dam once swallowed a river hole and handed it to a power grid 100 miles away. This is the story of what happens when a place is starved for 96 years, and then, almost on a whim of corporate math, is simply given its water back. Fossil Creek does not look like it belongs in Arizona. Picture a canyon deep enough to swallow the Statue of Liberty 4 times over, its walls dropping toward pools so clear and so blue-green they look photoshopped, even in person. The water carries an unusual amount of dissolved calcium, and as it slows around logs, boulders, and bends in the streambed, that mineral hardens into travertine, a pale, glassy limestone that entombs leaves and branches in stone, almost as you watch. Early settlers who wandered into the canyon assumed those calcified twigs were fossils, which is where the creek gets its name, even though there is not a genuine fossil in the entire watershed. What there is instead is a living rock factory, one of the most productive travertine systems anywhere in the United States, built entirely by a spring system that never stops. That spring system is the real star of this story. At the base of the canyon, a cluster of springs pushes out roughly 43 cubic feet of water per second, which works out to about 20,000 gallons every single minute, in flood years and drought years alike, holding at a nearly unchanging 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. In a state where surface rivers routinely vanish by July, that kind of reliability is almost unnatural. It is also exactly why, more than a century ago, somebody looked at Fossil Creek and saw not a fragile desert ecosystem, but a battery. Human beings had known this canyon long before anyone thought about turbines. Archaeological evidence suggests people have moved through this watershed for something like 10,000 years, and the Yavapai and Apache communities who call this region home still regard the canyon as ancestral land, not scenery. That context matters, because what came next was not simply an engineering project. It was a taking. In 1900, a rancher named Lou Turner staked a claim on the creek, and a year later he claimed the headwater springs themselves. At the time, mining boomtowns like Jerome and Clarkdale were desperate for electricity, and a spring that never stopped running looked, to industrial eyes, like power going to waste. What followed is one of the strangest construction stories in Arizona history. There was no road into the canyon and no railway anywhere close, so crews built a supply route from scratch, stretching more than 40 miles from the nearest rail stop at Mayer. Hundreds of mules and hundreds of laborers, many of them Apache and Mojave workers, hauled turbines, cement, and heavy equipment along a trail carved into raw cliffside terrain, dropping 1,600 feet from the rim down to the water. People died building that road. Animals died on it too. It was financed by a bond issue worth roughly $1.5 million, and it culminated in the Childs power plant switching on in the summer of 1909, followed a few years later by a second plant called Irving. To keep both stations running, engineers built more than 8,000 feet of wooden flumes and a concrete dam near the springs that captured almost the entire flow of the creek and redirected it into the turbines. For a while, this was considered a triumph of American engineering. By 1920, these two remote desert plants were supplying somewhere around 70% of the electricity for Phoenix, a city that was rapidly becoming one of the fastest-growing urban centers in the American Southwest. Streetlights, streetcars, and some of the valley's earliest air conditioners were running on power drawn from a limestone canyon most Phoenix residents had never seen and probably didn't know existed. The plants were later recognized as a historic mechanical engineering landmark, and in the early 1990s they were formally added to the National Register of Historic Places. On paper, this looked like an unqualified success story. Clean hydropower, decades of reliable service, historical significance. But that recognition only tells half of what was happening in the canyon below the dam. Downstream, the creek had been reduced to a ghost of itself. With almost the entire natural flow diverted into the flumes, the streambed below the dam sometimes carried as little as 1 or 2 cubic feet of water per second, a small fraction of what it should have carried. Travertine formation, the very process that defined the creek's identity, essentially stopped. The turquoise pools that had taken centuries to build began shrinking. Native fish species that existed nowhere else on Earth outside this one narrow watershed were squeezed into shrinking pockets of habitat, while non-native fish, better suited to slow, warm, marginal water, moved in and out-competed them. For a creek whose whole ecological signature was built on the relationship between abundant flowing water and mineral-rich stone, this wasn't simple decline. It was closer to erasure, and it played out quietly for nearly 100 years while the power plants above collected historical honors. By the 1990s, the math had shifted. The Childs and Irving plants were old, and by the standards of a modern electrical grid, their output was almost negligible. Environmental advocates had spent years documenting the damage. Collapsed travertine formation, shriveled wetlands, native fish populations pressed toward the edge of extinction. Arizona Public Service, the utility that had inherited the plants, was staring down the cost of relicensing century-old infrastructure for a return that barely mattered anymore. In 1999, the company made a decision that stunned a lot of people watching Western water politics. It agreed to voluntarily decommission both plants and restore the creek's full natural flow. Nobody sued them into it. No court order forced their hand. In a region where water rights are fought over more fiercely than almost anything else, a utility choosing to hand back 20,000 gallons a minute was almost unheard of. It's worth pausing on how rare this actually was. This marked only the second time in United States history that a dam had been removed purely for environmental reasons, following the removal of the Edwards Dam in Maine roughly 6 years earlier. But the Maine project had a clear commercial motive tied to it, restoring valuable fish runs with real recreational and market significance. Fossil Creek had none of that. The fish this restoration was meant to save, native suckers, dace, and chub, had essentially no commercial value at all. This was preservation for its own sake, which is exactly why plenty of observers at the time questioned whether spending an estimated $13 million on the project was worth it. At the ceremony marking the shutdown, Vincent Randall, a Yavapai Apache tribal historian and councilman, stood at the edge of the same canyon his ancestors had once been forced to haul cement and turbines into. According to accounts of the ceremony, he spoke about how his people had built that dam, and had lived with pride in what it accomplished for decades, but that its time had passed. He asked the creek itself for forgiveness. It's a small, human moment buried inside a much larger engineering and ecological story, but it captures something the spreadsheets never could. Here's the part that most people get wrong about dam removal. You cannot just flip a switch and expect nature to sort itself out. By 2004, the stretch of creek below the old dam was crowded with non-native fish that would have exploded in number the instant full flow returned, likely finishing off the very native species the whole project was designed to protect. So in the fall of 2004, close to 100 people, Forest Service staff, biologists from Arizona Game and Fish, and researchers from Northern Arizona University, worked together to strip the creek of its invasive fish and build a barrier designed to keep them from moving back upstream. The order of operations mattered enormously. Remove what didn't belong, hold that line, and only then return the water the ecosystem had been denied for nearly 100 years. One of the researchers central to this effort was Dr. Jane Marks, an ecologist from Northern Arizona University who had positioned her team on Fossil Creek years in advance, systematically measuring the starved creek's chemistry, its fish populations, and its rate of travertine formation, all benchmarked against a healthy reference stretch upstream that had never lost its flow. This kind of advanced preparation is almost never possible in river restoration work, because scientists rarely know years ahead of time exactly which river is about to be transformed. Here, they did, and that gave them an extraordinarily rare before and after dataset. On June 18, 2005, Arizona Public Service shut the flume system down for good. For the first time since 1909, the full force of the fossil spring system ran down its own natural channel. It didn't arrive as a wall of water. It crept forward, filling pockets, crevices, and side channels one at a time, while researchers and local residents lined the banks to watch it happen. This was the first time in the history of the American Southwest that a desert stream had been handed back its complete natural flow. Nobody had a script for what would come next, because nobody had ever tried this in a desert before. What happened next rewrote assumptions researchers had carried into the project. Marks and her colleagues had braced for a recovery that might take decades, the kind of slow, ecological healing typical of damaged river systems worldwide. Instead, fundamental processes in the stream began snapping back almost immediately. Photosynthesis rates in the creek climbed rapidly. Within a matter of seasons, not years, the stream's ability to cycle nutrients matched the healthy reference reaches upstream. The takeaway from the data was almost deceptively simple. A river is not a machine that stays broken forever once it's been broken. Give it its water back, and much of the damage can undo itself far faster than anyone expected. The travertine confirmed the same story in solid stone. Along stretches that had been starved for decades, mineral deposition had gone essentially dormant. The moment the flow returned, that process restarted almost immediately. New travertine formations began rising along a 6-mile stretch below the springs, some growing more than 2 centimeters a year, a rate you could track with a simple measuring tape. The turquoise pools that had defined the canyon for centuries began to refill and deepen again, visibly, within seasons. But it's the fish numbers that make this story almost impossible to overstate. With invasive species removed, the barrier holding firm, and full natural flow restored, the native fish that had been clinging to survival didn't just recover. Their populations exploded. Sonora suckers multiplied by roughly 17 times. Desert suckers climbed by something like 52 times their prior numbers. The round-tail chub, a species that had been circling local extinction, came back approximately 70-fold. And the speckled dace, an unassuming little native minnow that had nearly vanished from the canyon entirely, increased by an estimated 150 times its pre-restoration population. Sit with that for a second. A population teetering on the edge of local extinction came back more than 100-fold within a handful of years. Today, Fossil Creek is home to 9 native fish species. And it holds a distinction no other river stretch in Arizona can claim. It is the longest reach of river in the state where the native fish community exists completely free of non-native competitors. The restored corridor now supports something close to 200 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. In the 50-acre botanical area surrounding the springs alone, researchers have documented over 160 plant species. A creek that had been quietly dying beneath its own dam for a century had become, within a few short years, one of the richest pockets of biodiversity in the entire Southwest. And then, inevitably, the people arrived. In 2009, Congress designated nearly 17 miles of Fossil Creek as a wild and scenic river, one of only 2 stretches in all of Arizona to carry that federal protection. But a canyon full of warm, clear, turquoise water in the middle of the high desert proved impossible to keep secret. Visitor numbers climbed into the thousands every year, and with them came trampled banks, litter, and mounting pressure on an ecosystem that had only just been rebuilt. A river that had survived a hydroelectric empire was suddenly being worn down by tourists carrying coolers and wearing water shoes. The Forest Service responded with a tightening system of permits and reservations, capping how many people can enter the canyon on any given day. Having saved the creek from being drained dry, its stewards now find themselves protecting it from being loved to death. Through all of it, the springs themselves remain indifferent to human drama. They are still